And hello, friends. Welcome to our session today on the power of philanthropy in supporting effective advocacy through strategic communications framing. Oof, that was a lot of words. Let me see if I can untangle that for you for a second. So I should say I'm here today in a different role than usual, and just for a couple of minutes at the top of the show to share some thoughts as we launch into this session. And I'm wearing two, maybe even three hats today. As you probably know, I'm an executive fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, which has been working for now over a decade to break the cycle of generational poverty, specifically by rallying and supporting cross-sector coalitions in communities across the country, coalitions that are focused on supporting kids' learning and development. And we've zeroed in on early school success and third grade reading proficiency as indicators of that successful learning and development. So, as you probably don't know, I'm also the chair of the board of Leading for Kids, one of the organizations that's going to be presenting today. And I have to say my third hat is that I'm the former CEO of America's Promise, where we worked on many of these same communications challenges. And I feel like there's some unfinished business from that assignment that I'm trying to see through here. So I will say I've been working on this challenge of communicating about children's issues more effectively for decades. In 1997, I was deeply involved with the creation and execution of the President's Summit on America's Future, which was a three-day extravaganza in Philadelphia. It featured all the living presidents at the time. It gave rise to America's Promise. It was led by General Colin Powell and later by his wife, Alma Powell. We rallied all the presidents and the most popular man in America at the time to put more oomph behind the work of children's advocates, to get those advocates more of a hearing, and to get the public more rallied behind their work. And while the jolt of energy and resources generated by the President's Summit was pretty amazing, things didn't change, and they haven't changed nearly as much as we had hoped. We aren't where we want to be, and we have work to do. Now, my former boss, Alma Powell, was fond of saying that we don't lack the skill to make things better for kids, but somehow we lack the will. Now, that's not we who spend so much of our time and our lives trying to improve the life circumstances and life prospects for young people. We have plenty of will. But for all our commitment and our efforts, somehow we haven't yet been persuasive enough to garner the kind of sustained attention, focus, and determination to make the kind of changes that we want to see. Why is this? It's not for lack of trying, that's for sure. We've spent oodles of dollars and thousands of hours developing the kinds of communications that we think will really register and generate public support and demand for better investments and better outcomes. We've produced spoken and written beautiful, powerful, compelling words, and yet here we are, still far short of where we'd like to be. So that's why I was so delighted to meet David Alexander a few years ago, a person of exceptional talent, reach, and commitment who was determined to figure out this long-standing messaging conundrum. David connected with Frameworks Institute, happy to say, at an America's Promise event, with the enthusiastic support of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Leading for Kids, David, and Frameworks Institute set about to do the work we will discuss today. Now, we've all heard in one context or another, marriage, family, friendship, work, that the secret to communicating is actually to listen more carefully, to listen more thoughtfully, to listen for understanding. Well, that's exactly what Leading for Kids and Framework set out to do, to listen to really understand, and not to understand what people think about questions related to kids, but how people think about those questions. In other words, what are the mindsets or mental models that people apply when they think about questions related to children and youth? Today, we'll have the opportunity to hear about and discuss what Leading for Kids and Frameworks found, what they recommend in terms of a new frame for talking about kids' issues. To start, we'll hear from the wonderful Jeanette Elston from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She's a program officer in the Healthy Children and Healthy Families portfolio at the foundation. And Jeanette's going to talk about why RWJ supported this inquiry, this work with Leading for Kids and Frameworks, and why she and her colleagues are so excited about the possibilities in the findings and recommendations we're discussing today. I should also note that Jeanette and her colleagues at RWJ are important exemplars of the role that philanthropies can play in not only rethinking their own communications, but in supporting their grantees in aligning those grantees' communications with the recommendations that Leading for Kids and Frameworks have developed. I should note that Jeanette is only able to be here for our first hour, but she will be answering questions and we can reach her afterwards. All of us can reach her afterwards as well. So we're also joined today by David Alexander, as I mentioned, the president of Leading for Kids. Before launching Leading for Kids, David had a long career of promoting children's health and development as a pediatrician, leading children's hospitals, and then as the president and CEO of the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital Foundation in Palo Alto. Then we'll be joined for reactions, comments, and discussions by Marika Cox Mitchell and Dave Stone. Marika is the vice president of early childhood at the Bainham Family Foundation, where she leads the foundation's efforts to support children's healthy development and learning from birth to age 3, including importantly, investments in advocacy and policy change, as well as direct service. Then Dave Stone, the advocacy officer of the United Way of Central Iowa, will join us. Dave leads the government relations and advocacy efforts to advance the collective goals of the United Way and its coalition partners, including especially strategies related to early childhood and educational success, as well as essential needs, economic opportunity, and health and well-being. With that, I'm going to turn this over to our moderator for the day, Ernestine Benedict, who's the Chief Communications and Marketing Officer at 0 to 3. As I turn this over to Ernestine, with thanks for your leadership on this important session, as well as the session you moderated around similar issues a couple of months ago. Thanks to all of you for being here today for this conversation, and take it away, Ernestine.
Thank you so much, John, for that inspiring intro and grounding for our discussion today. I am honored to be here with everyone. It is indeed a new day and a new dawn, and we're here together to sharpen the tools in our toolkit, right? To ensure that every day is a better day for our children. And we have quite the lineup to dig into this topic, and I'm really excited for each of these leaders to share their insights. So with that, we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to ask Jeanette to come online with us and share her incredible insights. This is actually the second time that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading has hosted a session on collective caregiving. And this one is focused on the importance of the funder role. Before I ask David, Jeanette, to give us an overview of the new frame, I'd like to really invite you to share insights from the funder perspective as to why RWJF chose to invest in this work. What led you to become one of the lead investors in the research as well as developing the frame itself? Uh-oh, Jeanette, I think the mute button got you.
Oh goodness, I made the classic error.
That's okay.
Thank you, Ernestine, and thank you, Campaign for Grade Level Reading, for hosting this space. I'm Jeanette. I work at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and specifically, I'm on our Healthy Children and Families strategic portfolio. And I love this question, and I think I'm happy to talk about how we came into supporting this work, and also why we would do it again if we were to be embarking on this right now. The short answer is we supported this work because we knew that really addressing the long-term mindset that impact how we invest in children and families is really what we need to create conditions in the long run to push for policy and systems change that promote equitable child and family well-being. So our goal has always been to ensure that all parents and caregivers have the resources they need to promote thriving families. And although our strategy has evolved and gotten sharper over the last few years, uh, at the heart has always been spurring equitable distribution of resources that enable child and family well-being. And we have come to understand that there are really deeply held mindsets that are rooted in structural racism, like deservingness and individualism, that are huge barriers in supporting policies that undergird child and family well-being. And so, all the way back in 2019, we were really excited when Leading for Kids teamed up with Frameworks. um, Leading for Kids, an organization that is fully dedicated to promoting the health and well-being of all children, and Frameworks, who really understands how to get deeply underneath cultural mindsets and how to ask those questions, and really investigate what were those mindsets that are really standing in the way of more collective support. And we funded the project to support establishing a strong baseline of research about frames that well, that we're currently using, and equip activists, advocates, practitioners with more effective frames to advocate for a better future for children and families. And we also wanted to fund them to actually move that research to action. And so to work with people who might be using that research to apply the findings in their own context.
That's
So
fantastic. I mean, research to action. That's what we're trying to get to today. And it's important to understand the research. So, David, we know now why RWJF made this investment. And we'd love for you to tell us what Leading for Kids and Frameworks we're trying to achieve through the research. Who is this, frame aimed at? And to really really paint the picture for us.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's really nice to see everybody. And thanks to the campaign for hosting this event. And, thanks to Jeanette and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for supporting this work. As John mentioned, I'm a pediatrician. I'm not only a pediatrician, I'm an old pediatrician. I trained a long time ago. I've been in this space for a long time. And on the one hand, if you look at children's health defined narrowly, like pediatricians think about it, we've made incredible progress since I trained. Just amazing things have happened. But if you look at the well-being of children and all those other things that define how kids are doing, we really haven't moved very much. And I, for the last 25 or 30 or even 40 years, have been thinking about this big paradox. As John mentioned, we know what to do to move all of these things that are holding our kids back. And we have tens of thousands of fantastic organizations that have great solutions for these problems, but we haven't been able to move them. What is it about us that has kept us from doing this? And another paradox is that we as individuals, as Americans, really center the decisions we make in our personal lives around what's good for our kids and our grandkids. That's the way Americans live their lives. If there's a decision to be made, what's good for their kids and grandkids really is what's central to that decision. But that's not the way we act together. We don't do that collectively. So Leading for Kids was started in 2018 to try to understand what is it about America and our culture that puts us in this situation, and to try to think about ways that we might be able to change that. So we were very fortunate to hook up with the incredibly smart social scientists at the Frameworks Institute, who have been working on trying to understand the way Americans think about all sorts of issues for the last 25 years. And we started a project that we thought was going to be an 18-month project in 2020, which tells you how challenging this work was, to really understand the way Americans think deeply about children, and then to try to figure out ways to change that in the following ways. What we're trying to do with this work is to do really three things. Number one, to improve the way America, or to increase our sense of collective responsibility for all children. So as I said, we all focus our attention on the kids in our own lives. How can we talk about kids in ways that increases our sense of collective responsibility. Second of all, there is a sense in our society that there are some kids who are more deserving of our help than others. And as Jeanette mentioned, some of this is rooted in structural racism. Some of this is rooted in the deeply held mindsets that we all have about, and it's a deeply held American mindset about the struggle of the individual, and what happens to you is largely a response to your own actions. So can we decrease the sense that some kids are less deserving than others? And then the third thing we were trying to do is, can we talk about kids' issues in a way that increases their salience? So if you ask the average American if you think this program or this issue is important, everybody will say that it is. But we don't act collectively that day. And the way people in our public life make decisions and act on kids' issues doesn't influence the way people vote for them. So those are the things that we were trying to work on with this, to try to increase our sense of collective responsibility, to increase the sense that all children are deserving, and to increase the salience of kids' issues.
Those are huge, huge aims. Definitely considering our cultural and political landscape. But I think what's really critical at this juncture is to get a sense of what is the frame? What are the messages that we find are going to be most compelling to inform and make that mindset shift begin to happen, particularly when we're talking about supporting kids and families?
Yeah, so yeah, as I said, this project took a long, long time, and that's because coming to this answer was a very, very long process, and we tried a lot of things before we hit on something that actually worked. So there were really two big phases to this project. There was some background work that was trying to understand the deep cultural beliefs that Americans have about kids and families. And then we started testing frames. And I'm not going to, there are resources online, which I assume that campaign will make available to you, that talk about these cultural mindsets. But I want to focus on one of them, which is that Americans really look at these children, at children as beings that need care. And what Americans believe determines how well a child does in life is the love and care that's provided to them by the people in their lives. And that is not untrue. That is a true statement. But that belief tends to sort of shut out all the systemic things outside of the immediacy of the child's life that impact the child's well-being. This notion that it's care that determines what kids do is really, really strongly held belief among Americans. So we also looked at the way American children's advocates talk about kids' issues. And it's important to sort of level set with people the way we talk now. And it turns out that there are really three ways that we as kids advocates talk about why kids should get the things we all know that they should get. We use one of three frames. We say kids should get this thing that we think is important. Kids should get whatever because it's the right, moral, just thing to do, right? So that's frame number one. And all of us as kids advocates really like that one, and we use it all the time. Frame number two is we should do this thing for kids because they're vulnerable, they're at risk, and we have to stand up for them. It's our job as advocates to stand up for these kids. That's frame number two. And then frame number three, which is actually a relatively new one, really in the last 20 or 25 years, is that we should do this thing for kids because we need to invest in them now because they're our future. And if you think about kids advocacy in America, if you think about the organizations you work with, they are using one, two, or three of those frames to justify whatever it is that they're working on. And I would argue that we would be in much worse shape if organizations weren't out there using these advocacy messaging, these three techniques that I just talked about, but they have gotten us exactly where we are today. And that to move things along further, we need a new frame, a new way of talking to the public that's actually meeting them more where they are. And so we started, and we literally were supposed to spend 4 months identifying and testing new frames. And it took us almost 2 years. And that's because it was a joke within the project that the more David Alexander was excited about a frame we were going to test, the worse it ended up doing with the general public when we went out to actually test it. And about a year and a half into the work, one of the frameworks people said, why don't we step back and stop doing all these clever things that we thought we were going to do, these little turns of phrase, and go back to where people are starting from with kids, and that kids are these creatures that need care. And so the idea of this building on the way people think about care became our frame that we're recommending now to the field. And if you can put up the slide that I had about this. So right now, people think about care in three ways. Most people think about care as something that's provided by individuals in a child's life um, to that individual child. So care is individualized. It's provided by a teacher to a child, or a doctor to a child, or a parent to a child, or a grandparent to a child. And the first recommendation in this set of framing recommendations is to stretch that to get people to understand that care is something that we can do together for all children. So it's redefining a whole lot of cultural behaviors as care. So one of the ways that we care for kids together is by voting for candidates who think about kids when they do their work. So that's stretch number one, taking care from something that's individual to something that's collective. The second way we think about care is that we care for our kids and kids who are like our kids. And the second thing that this frame is trying to do is to take that notion of care is kind of to our kids and kids like ours, and get it to stretch to things like kids. We need to care for all kids. So care is inclusive of all children. And that we together have a responsibility to care for all kids in every community, including those who don't look like our own kids. And then the third thing, and this came out of the mindset research, is that people in America have a very narrow set of things that they think about as children's issues. And they're issues that are, quite frankly, that look like care. So child care, people recognize as a children's issue, a little bit of health care, education, but people don't think about things like housing as a children's issue, as a children's issue. They don't think about the tax code as a children's issue, which may be part of the problem we had with the child tax credit. They don't think of hunger as a kid's issue. And so the third thing that this frame attempts to do is to expand what people think of as care issues, and get people to realize that care happens through all of these things, through every issue. So I will stop there, and we'll have more chance to talk about what this actually looks like in practice later on.
Those three areas of collective care were really great to see front and center. And Jeanette, I'd love to know if you have anything you'd want to add to what David shared about the collective caregiving frame, particularly from the funder perspective and investing in its overall development.
Thank you, David, for going over that so concisely. And I know it's a joke that you keep making about how, it's everything that you thought might work didn't, but it requires a level of humility and curiosity that I've so appreciated in this work. I think what I would add from the funder perspective is that the collective caregiving framing strategy is a framing strategy. So care is collective, care is inclusive, care is expansive, are ways to frame to sort of like move away from priming or triggering thoughts about individualism or who deserves and who doesn't, and more towards activating those collective mindsets that do exist, but maybe aren't as dominant in our culture, but they aren't messages. So what's important is about how how this gets applied with different audiences and different contexts. And that's a lot. That's where David said this work took 4 or 5 years. The real work begins not that now, and so from a funder perspective, it really requires very long-term investment in not only the research, but for people who are in all areas of the field, people who are advocates, people who are narrative strategists, people who are working with families directly to actually do the work within their organizations to absorb research like this, to make sense of it and apply it in their own context.
I mean, that's such a great segue into hearing more about, the toolkits, the frame itself and the accompanying toolkits were released just last year. Can you tell us about how, or a little bit about RWJF steps for its usage, even including how the foundation staff is drawing on this research to inform its own framing around kids and families, or your overall programmatic approach?
I'm happy to speak to that, and mostly from the Healthy Children and Families perspective. So I like to think of this as not only in terms of the communications that we use, but also in actually how we approach the strategy of our work. So one of the things that came out of this research that David pointed out is that um, people think of children and families very narrowly in the context of care. Um, and they see children and families as being separate from issues that they might think are more pertinent or more salient, like the economy. And so we've actually um, shifted some of our work on healthy children and families to more focus on sort of raising awareness, consciousness about how children and families are impacted by the economy, and also bringing to light how children and families are being seen as completely outside, completely independent, is by design. Um, Care is undervalued as of the act of caregiving because it's not necessarily tied to like economic growth or production or labor. And so part of this work was internalizing it in our strategy. But it also was helpful in giving pivots to how we frame how we speak about this work. So, for example, we try and stay far away from referring to things like working families because it can invoke the sense that if you are working, you may be more quote unquote deserving, and even just like saying that might reinforce something that we wouldn't be trying to do. So those are a couple of things. And then we also sort of supported Leading for Kids to follow on from the initial research grant with frameworks to work with communications folks, to work with advocates at national advocacy organizations to actually come together and formulate how they wanted to implement this research together. And that in and of itself has been another 18 months to 2 years just to do that relational work and to actually sit with this and grapple with it.
I mean, that's really powerful, and there's a lot of patience in this work. And so um, I am admittedly an Instagram junkie. And let me be clear, the um, boldness with which RWJF has come out around its health equity focus is inspiring. So I recommend everyone check that out. And what I'd love to know, though, is that this work is really long term, as you just talked about. It's a generational, even a multi-generational approach. David references this in the frame. And how do you see it advancing the foundation's mission of health equity?
And this comes back to when I said at the very top of like, this is why we funded it, but this is why I would fund it again. So over the course of this research, of this project that took place over, I really do think it was 5 years, um, we we sort of restated our mission at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So we are committed to improving health and health equity in the United States. And in partnership with others, we're committed to taking bold leaps to transform health in our lifetime and pave the way together to a future where health is no longer a privilege, but a right. And to achieve that, we need to deepen our focus on dismantling structural racism as one of the biggest barriers to health in America. And that naming that explicit focus on dismantling structural racism is something that evolved in parallel to this project taking place. And addressing structural racism is generational work. And as a foundation, we have articulated 3 generational goals that we believe we can and must achieve in collaboration with others, with our grantees and our partners and communities. On healthy children and families, we're most anchored in economic inclusion for family well-being. And that's overcoming the legacy that undervalues caregivers and creating a new social contract that really acknowledges our interdependence, and that sort of we all have a collective stake in the well-being of all children and families. And so baked into our mission is that this work is generational. And that when it comes to supporting long-term mindset shifts, we also understand that that is going to take, it's not going to take a grant cycle. It's not going to take 2 or 3. And so we've really approached this work not in terms of, okay, what quote unquote policy wins do we see, or did we shift a narrative in 2 years? It is much more about how are we strengthening an ecosystem to create stronger narratives and frames over time? Are we supporting an ecosystem to apply that in their context, to grapple with it with their audiences? And that's how we've approached the work. And I've been really excited to see more funders recognizing that narrative change is a long-term endeavor. If you have questions about, if you're working on this in your organization and you want to connect about how we've talked about progress and indicators and all of that, I'm happy to connect with you, because I think this is something that we can get stronger with as a sector.
I love that call for connection. It is so spot on, and I would love to broaden the perspective here and invite Dave and Marika to join us and really dig in further on how this mindset or these cultural mindsets are showing up and impacting their work. So, Dave, I'll start with you. In your role as an advocacy officer at United Way of Central Iowa, I know that you are focused on really making the case for systems level change to create those conditions for kids and families to really thrive. Can you tell us about those efforts and really where you encounter any of these cultural mindsets that David and Jeanette just mentioned, and what they look like? Where do they get in the way?
Mhm. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation so far. I am really excited about this frame, as you know, this is kind of really in line of where we're going with some of our messaging as well around early childhood areas. Our work has been integrated across all of our focus areas. Really, it is a cradle to career approach when it comes to early brain health, early learning experiences, the K-12 experience, then into higher ed or seeking out credentials or trade associations, and finally into those structural things like we discuss in essential needs, which is housing and hunger and healthcare access. At United Way, we don't only just do investments in these areas, but we're also encouraging volunteers in these areas to create mentorships and partnerships around reading with some of our youngest kiddos, but also then that systems level advocacy that you're talking about. And we do work at the local, state, and federal level. I always joke I'm a little like Mr. Smith going to Washington at the federal level. I can ask nicely, but I'm not going to move Congress anytime soon. But what I think is really important about this work is the Caribbean collective creates that buy-in amongst the community. It is not just my kids, it is not just my family or my network. It is a community, and it is bringing us to that community view, which I think is much better than the individualistic experience that we'll be heading into here. I would be remiss that we all talk about the coming political environment that we're going to be into. Individualism is going to be, the new hot point. And we have to really drive people to that collective shared vision and avoid fortress mentality, where everyone kind of clashes over finite dollars or, what's mine and yours. We really still have to work together collectively. The other thing about the frame that I really like in the inclusive portion of it is that there's too much othering that happens in our world right now. You know, as we already mentioned, working families indicates a mindset for some folks. The working poor, these language choices really choose to separate and divide people when in reality there are so many commonalities amongst all families of all income levels. Finally, in terms of expansive, uh, I do really enjoy the fact that we can work on this as a community, and including everyone, because you know, we work on childcare issues a lot at United Way, and that is an issue that affects all families of all income levels. It may uh, be more of a struggle for our lower income families, but even those in upper middle class or higher middle class are spending a ridiculous portion of their salaries or budgets on childcare, which creates a pinch for everybody. And so this is going to be an interesting approach. Further, I always think that what's really successful when we're talking with policymakers is they respond to clear, consistent messaging that they hear over and over and over again. You know, there's that old marketing adage, you have to hear something 7 times before it sticks. Maybe it's something like 14 times for a policymaker, but they need to hear it over and over again. And I think what we found to have such great success is when all of our partners, all of our advocates, all of our volunteers are singing from the same hymnal. And that's when we, you know, that eliminates the out, if you will, for a policymaker saying, well, all of you agree, except for a couple of you don't. And so that means I'm not going to touch this issue. You have to work it out amongst yourselves first. When we're successful, it's that everyone shares that same message, that frame, and all are committed to it.
So incredibly true and powerful. And Marika, just like United Way of Central Iowa, Bainham, as we know, focuses on both policy advocacy and direct service investments in early care, education, and family well-being. Can you share about your efforts in strengthening systems and how these cultural mindsets are affecting your work? From the perspective of how your work is influencing and impacting families.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, great to be a part of this conversation. Like many other funders, we are an early childhood funder, and our early childhood portfolio mirrors the complex and comprehensive nature of this critical phase of development. So our portfolio has lots of both ands. We research policy and practice. We are at the local level with partners, but also have partners working at the state level, federal level, national levels. But one of the both ends that makes our portfolio very dynamic is sort of the navigating and the reimagining and the systems change. So we certainly support young children in communities and families where they are to help them sort of just navigate and frankly survive. But we're also looking at the conditions that are holding those, the problems they're navigating, the pain points they're navigating in place. And so we're also focused on systems change. And I think that duality of the navigating, the reimagining, to do systems change well, you do have to interrogate the system and look at some of the sort of implicit and semi-explicit levels. And mindsets is a really important component of examining systems change. And so I'll say for funders like the Bainham Family Foundation, if you're doing systems change work and you're not minding the mindsets, or you're not creating space to do sort of the internal investigations that this caregiving framework is asking us to do, we're really not doing systems change work. And great to have this tool to use that to sort of make sure that we're minding the mindsets as we push towards systems change.
So there comes a point in some conversations that I have where I'm like, whatever that person says has just like literally taken me to church, right? And so what I mean by that is that it is a moment that you feel it not just in the head, but also in the heart. And so I just want to lift up what Marika said about navigating and reimagining. I mean, we're in a time when those principles are at the base of everything we do at this point. It's such an opportunity. And I'd love to know from both you, Marika, and Dave, given your experience in thinking about this strategic framing related to kids and families, what reflections do you have on the potential of this new frame, particularly in helping build a broader base for the support of the work you do and the families you support?
I can go ahead. Again, it gets back to that collective component and buy-in from the community, as well as the othering. And the example that's coming to mind for me in our state of Iowa is we've had a lot of issues in the past couple of years around kids and hunger. Our state is one of those states that did not take the summer EBT dollars or Sunbucks dollars. And it was because the government here decided that that was not a great way to improve childhood nutrition in our state, that it was actually an obesity issue. These are the kind of things that this kind of frame can really help us work through, understanding that, those funds are critically important, that this is not an us versus them component, and that we need to make sure that our kiddos have the supports necessary. And so I'm really excited about this new frame to bring to our local and state policymakers. Further, I would say that, we're going to be heading into one of the areas that I've worked a lot in since the grants passed decision from SCOTUS is the unhoused population. And this is an area I think that children get left out of the conversation in terms of those who are experiencing homelessness. In our communities, we have very limited family shelter options available. In fact, for a family to get on the wait list, there's something like 300 people ahead of them in line waiting for a family shelter. And what that ends up meaning is families get split apart. The mom and the kiddo have to go to one shelter. Maybe the other parent or male in the family has to go to yet another one. This is not the best way we should be thinking about these things. And bringing the families together, keeping them together, and having that community level responsibility for that, I think this frame is going to start picking away at some of those individual minded mindsets, if you will, amongst our community members and neighbors.
Strengthening families across all the supports they need, I think, is such a great starting point for understanding this frame. I'm so glad you lifted that up. Marika, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it's also reassuring. It reflects the science of child development. I'm as a someone who's sort of trained as an early childhood educator. It's like absolutely ditto. This is exactly what we know to be true about how young children learn and develop, and the sort of the collective nature of this approach, or in the focus on the ecosystem. It's like ditto, very reassuring and reaffirming. I'll also say it reflects ancestral knowledge and ways of being. Many communities have long known that it takes a village to raise a child, and great to see sort of that knowledge base, ancestral knowledge base reaffirmed here. And in the communities we serve, those closest to young children are, we call them sort of our proximity experts, will say, absolutely, frankly, what took you all so long to reframe the message? It was always about community. We all do play a role in supporting each child in our community. So I think it's definitely very reassuring and aligns research, policy, and practice in a beautiful way. I also think it's very effective. It's American centric. I often say that typically when we're asked about an example of a progressive policy, we turn to Germany and Finland, and I'm like, yes, but sure. Can we contextualize it a little for who we are? And I think this framework does that. It still pushes us to be better, but it's very American centered.
I mean, everything you said is so true. And I'm wondering, for either you or Dave, have you shifted any of the messaging coming from your foundation to better reflect this frame? or do you see opportunities to make those shifts?
I can go ahead. Yeah, I do believe we've already started this sort of language shift for us a little bit in terms of some of the specific policy priorities that we were facing at the end of last year. I think there's ways for us to incorporate this more into our early childhood success work, because I think, as many of you know, lots of us have been around this work for decades. And so transitioning our existing advocates, our existing stakeholders, that takes a process to not unload the previous message, but let's say build upon their knowledge. And getting that transition, it takes a while for folks to really switch that lever to go from the old way of talking about something to the new way of talking about something.
I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah, and similarly, so at the Bain Family Foundation with our We Vision Early Ed initiative, which is reimagining the childcare system. Certainly, we were quickly flip through the framework to see if there's any alignment between the 5 core mindset shifts we named there, and definitely saw alignment. For example, the focus on the universal and the targeted, knowing when to go universal and when to focus on targeted communities that have been intentionally marginalized, the collective ownership and collective responsibility for caregiving. So again, great to see the mindset shift. I think as funders, sometimes we also forget that we need to be the change, and we often say here that we are who we say we are, and so we've been sort of looking at our own language, interrogating our own language, from our annual reports to a LinkedIn post, and to see whether or not we are advancing the more progressive, effective language. Are we shifting the mindsets, or are we too holding the outdated mindsets in place? So I think we've used it as a way of guiding our We Vision Early Ed initiative and making sure there's alignment, but also sort of, again, looking at our own use of language to see whether or not we are retaining and holding on to the outdated mindsets, or are we shifting as we are holding others accountable to shift? And it takes time, as you noted, Dave.
Yeah, it takes time, but it takes the intentionality and the time, and I thank you for really lifting that up. David, I would love to, and Jeanette, I would love to know, as you've seen organizations and individuals begin to use this framing strategy, what's been working well, and where have conversations or approaches gotten stuck?
So, just a couple of thoughts that may be answering your question or not. First of all, I want to just sort of emphasize the fact that the frames that we have been using, the ones that I articulated earlier, there's nothing wrong with them, right? It's not like people have been doing something bad by being out there and advocating. So what we've been doing has gotten us where we are today. And the question is, how can we move beyond that? And I just want to reemphasize that the purpose of this new frame is to widen the audience for this message, to broaden the tent of people that are really interested in the well-being of all of our kids. There's been, obviously, because of what's been going on, there's a lot of focus on our current politics. And this frame was not designed to be a response to our current politics, because the culture that created the politics that we started with the inauguration yesterday existed before the inauguration, right? So this frame is really designed to meet the culture where it's at. Now, that said, another point I want to make, and for those of you who have the time and patience to read through a lot of social science research, I'll ask Sarah to make sure that the original research paper is posted and available to you. But this frame works well with all audiences, but it works especially well with people who define themselves as conservative or Republican. It moves them more because they have further to move than it does people who would define themselves as progressive. So it's an especially potent way to talk about issues in this current environment. And I'd make one other comment, which is this work has really helped me and probably others think about how we talk about equity. As part of the work, we looked at the way the general public thinks about equity, and we use that term all the time. One of the encouraging pieces of our research is that when we looked at how advocates are communicating today, virtually every kids advocacy organization is talking about equity. The problem is that the general public does not know what that means. And with this work, we think we have a more compelling way to talk about what equity means, defining it essentially as unequal care. That we provide less care to certain communities. And that's a way to talk about equity in a way that's perhaps more available to the general public than just talking about a term that most people don't actually understand.
Thank you for lifting that up, David. Jeanette, we'd love to hear, as David just reminded us and several of the panelists have reminded us, this work is complex. It takes time, persistence, and collaboration. How are you supporting your grantees in doing this work, incorporating the frame?
I think entering with curiosity and entering with this as an offer has been really important. So we have a platform, and I'll put it in the chat in a little bit, called Every Family Forward, where we have learning conversations just like this with our grantees. And we had a conversation about the collective caregiving strategy as a way of introducing it. And also we have then we have a discussion, then that starts a conversation, rather than saying like, here, go and do. It's now asking the question, what do you as a field need in order to support using more constructive frames? And we've heard a lot similar to what Marika and Dave have lifted up, which is that it's a lot of internal work to integrate across strategy, not only in communications, and it requires collaboration and alignment across people in the field. So we're at the starting gate. This is, this is part of introducing this and hearing what is needed to support the application of this. The other thing that has come up a lot, it actually came up in the Q&A, which is, how do you, some concerns about how like a collective caregiving frame might sort of trigger certain or might invoke things like quote unquote communism that would sort of shut down the conversation. And what is always really helpful to reiterate is that this is a frame. It's not about suggesting language. So it's like how you present information, less so about the actual words. And that's the work now of, I know Leading for Kids, maybe David can talk more about this, is working with communications folks to help translate this into messages. The toolkits are there as well. So I think that's what I would have to say.
That's really helpful to really understand what it looks like at the grantee support level. And I would invite Dave and Marika to share their thoughts on what it might look like to really provide the right supports to help folks go from the frame to strengthening their messaging to bring more people on board.
I mean, I'll say overly simplistic perhaps, but just like time, like just space. I mean, this level of sort of mindset shifting requires just some time to sort of sit with it, into some sort of individual reflection, group reflection. So just providing the time and space and funding for this mindset shifting work.
I would say that, this is a frame and this is not necessarily a tactical messaging approach. And so in order for organizations to particularly start implementing this work, it takes time. It may also take additional funding to help support that message creation. They may need to take this frame to, a messaging firm or someone else to really wrap their heads around it and give them those tactical messages that they would implant. So flexible funding for marketing, communications, and advocacy support. These are always good things because these are rare dollars for a lot of grantees. And, we're going to give them a really excellent platform and framework. But again, it's how do they operationalize it for their specific unique needs in their organization.
Really
Understand, I
helpful.
want to make just one comment. This is the work ahead, right? And as Jeanette said, this is a generation's worth of work. And other big cultural mindsets, we as Americans are capable of making big mindset shifts. I've often kind of joked around with my 30-something-year-old son that when I was in college, I didn't know any gay people. And that's not true. I knew gay people, but I didn't know anybody who was out. And it's amazing to think about how we as a culture changed our mindset about gay people and the way that the role that they play in being part of our society. Because my son's generation thinks about sexuality like they think about handedness. And that is not the way it was 35 or 40 years ago. So this is long-term work. This is a generation's worth of work. Now, to build on what David said, this is a frame, not a message. And we have just started now thinking about how to translate this into messaging. So a couple of things. There is now a set of toolkits, which are really examples that are out there for people to see what this looks like in use. Another thing that we are working on, and this is thanks to continued funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we have been working with a group of organizations to develop a communications plan. How do we get this work actually out into the world and used? And so more to come on that.
Great. And I just want to point out that many of the resources that have been mentioned by our panelists are showing up in the chat. So please grab those links if they're relevant for you. And we have had a lot of rich discussion, and we do have a question in the Q&A, but I want to encourage more folks to pose their questions. If it's coming to your mind, please put it out there. And I think that, Jeanette, you have to jump a little early. So before you hop, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yes, and I regret that I have to depart at 1:30 Eastern, but I really appreciate the opportunity to have been part of this conversation. I've learned from all of you just in this short time together. I would say this is work. Someone said you have to repeat something 7 times. So this is work that is requires persistent, flexible, and patient funding. So I guess I would say that 7 times over. Supporting framing research is one aspect of supporting long-term narrative change. It's an important piece and an important component, and it is one of many. So if you would like to connect with me, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Thank you so very much, and look forward to connecting with you more soon.
Thank you, Jeanette. Take care. And so our Q&A is filling up. So I'm going to get these to our panelists and continue this conversation. Jeanette pointed out one of the questions earlier, and I'd like to give others an opportunity to dig in here about how do you move from mindset to collective action. And as an example, in the person who provided the question, one of the 5 CI principles is shared data. How does collective caregiving translate into data collection in the analysis realm? Where are examples of early collective caregiving success in shifting and leveraging data sharing to support that narrative change? And I put that out to all of you, but David, I see the wheels turning as I'm asking the question.
Yeah, uh, they're turning. I mean, I think the answer to this is that the data you'd collect and how you'd collect it is probably not affected by this frame. How you talk about that data would very much be reflected by this framing. So, you know, the framing is not really to tell people what to do or what their work should be, or it's not about any specific issue. The real question is when you have data you want to talk to the public about, how do you do that? You know, so how do you talk about what's important to you? And that's really where this work comes in. So I don't think that the purpose of this was to change the work that you're doing or the way you're collecting data. I think the purpose is, you know, when you get results or when you want to talk to public officials or the public, you know, how do you talk about what you're doing? That's really what this is about.
Helpful, very helpful. I'm going to move on to another question that we received about, they'd love to hear about suggested outcomes when pitching a funder request using this framework. A lot of funders have been working with a very specific outcome heavy and they're finding their requests are getting declined. So, you know, what are some of those requests when you're talking about systems focused work? How can you start to incorporate this language in a way that resonates with funders? I think that's at the heart of this question. And I clearly open that up to Marika and
Yeah,
Dave.
sure. I mean, I'll say I think about the conversations we have as funders, national funders, local funders in many configurations. I think funders are recognizing that they need to shift as well to providing more long-term funding, more flexible funding, recognizing that there's systems change in vision or their work to move, make a policy move or support advocacy requires the type of funding you're looking for and requires us to sort of detach away from the archaic mindsets in philanthropy around outcomes and being extremely rigid, that it's sort of there's a misalignment. And so a lot of the funder conversations I'm a part of, as well as certainly here at the Bain Family Foundation, we fund in a way that supports the outcomes we're looking for around systems change. Again, recognizing it requires long-term, sustainable, stable funding and a bit of flexibility and room for innovation.
I would say from a United Way perspective, we have had a long history of funding programs. And when we're talking about system level change, that is really kind of infused across an organization's mission, not just necessarily one program. And so getting to that mindset as a funder is important. Furthermore, we've actually been working with our partners to define what system level change really tactically means for us so that we can address our application processes and how allow them to see their work in systems level change. Furthermore, I would also say collaboration, especially when we're talking about individual grant applications and funding decisions. No one entity is going to be successful at shooting the moon in passing new public policy or community level change on their own. And so looking at ways that collaboration is occurring across our partnership, our partners, that's critically important in this work because again, no one entity will do this. It takes a village.
Yeah. And so, you know, a lot of the conversation we've had here has been affirming and reassuring, but there is a palpable energy around what you can do, what you can't do, what you can say, what you can't say. And so we have a few questions in the Q&A around similar themes that folks are excited about reframing ideas and moving this narrative, but there's a real concern when you do take the frame and put it into action and into words, that they're words that just aren't, that are now trigger words, equity and collective and inclusive, which are all tied so closely to the frame. So I think the question really is here, you know, how do you really move this frame forward if many of the supporting vocabulary is, you know, a trigger, or seen as negative?
So let me take a start on that. Once again, those words that we're saying are problematic now, those may be a description of the frame, but it's not a message, right? So we would not ever recommend an organization that said we need to be out there doing collective care. And as I said, it's probably easier to think about examples of this frame in action. So a good example of this would be I'll pick on a policy issue that we all worked on and failed collectively on, which was the child tax credit. So early in the pandemic, the government, for whatever reason, decided that they wanted to provide what most industrialized countries in the world do, which is extra support for families with children. The way we did it was somewhat strange, and the way we advocated for it was, in retrospect, if you understand the way Americans think about um, kids and family, was even stranger. So it turns out that there's two ways that well, there's many ways, but I'll give you two divergent ways that we could have or did talk about the child tax credit. What we as kids advocates kept talking about during the 2 years that the child tax credit was in place is that this is the single biggest investment that the federal government has ever made to decrease child poverty, and it's worked, right? So that was the message that we as advocates were out there with for 2 years. And that is a true statement. It was the single biggest improvement we have ever made in terms of child poverty in America. The problem is, and I wish I didn't have to say this, but that Americans do not care about poor people. And because of this whole mindset that we deeply hold about, some of it is tied in structural racism, some of it is tied in this mindset of individuality. If you're poor, it's because you didn't try hard enough, right? So Americans, I wish it weren't the case, but focusing on the poor in our messaging may have decreased the amount of public support we could have built for this program. Now, another way to frame the child tax credit might have been, one of the most important things we can do to care for our families is to make sure that they have the resources they need to raise their children. And the child tax credit provides 90% of American families with additional resources that they need to raise their kids. That's the same program, but framed differently. And our research suggests that that might have been a more effective way to talk about that very important program. So I'll give you one more example. If you want to talk about, and we're not saying you avoid talking about equity or about race, but to frame it differently. So one of the most important things, we could talk about the fact that we have inequitable funding in our public school system, which we do. But another way to frame that subject is to say that one of the most important things that we can do for our kids is to make sure that their schools have the resources that they need for their kids to learn. Right now, we're not doing that. We don't provide that care equally, and we especially don't provide that kind of care equally in schools that are predominantly Black and brown. Now, we have tested that framing, and that framing lands better with the public than just talking about inequitable funding for schools. So once again, it's not the message that's different, it's just the way it's put out into the world. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So knowing the landscape we're in, and Dave, you brought this to light as soon as you started responding. There's a question that combines what I talked about earlier, the head and the heart. How do you stay hopeful and resist being or feeling discouraged? What are some of the biggest myths that need to be demystified? And I think from the funder lens, there obviously supports to the grantees to make them feel hopeful in their work? Can you share how you're supporting your grantees and just general thoughts about how everyone in the trenches of this work stays uplifted, given the landscape that we're in today?
This isn't the first time we've been in a similar environment. This may be the most prescient time of what we're facing now. However, there's been plenty of points in history where we've had this sort of pendulum swing towards kids, away from kids, towards kids. I think just having a foundation in the importance of the work that we're doing always helps folks, find that purpose, because there are going to be a lot of challenging days coming in the next few years. And so keeping sort of your eyes on the prize. The other thing is, I always think of breaking up larger projects into smaller digestible wins. In this environment, small little wins add up to a big win. And if we're going to continue to just sort of hammer home on a very huge policy or a huge shift in something, we very likely would be just talking to brick walls. But if we can break up that proposal into small little wins, that not only buoys our supporters, our stakeholders, but also it's how we slowly move the needle. I think we all want our big, we just had MLK Day moment where we all want our big MLK moment. That takes a lifetime, and I would rather have a lot of quick little wins that move the needle just a little bit than shooting the moon on one thing that may take 4, 5, 6 years to get through.
Thank you for that, Dave. Anyone else want to comment?
Once again, there's been a lot of focus on pendulum swinging and what happened yesterday. And I would argue once again that what happened yesterday is a reflection of the culture that we are in, right? Nothing changed yesterday in terms of our culture. And it's really that culture change that has to happen if we're really going to move the needle on this. I'll give you one encouraging little experiment that we did during this project. So one of the things that we did, and this is a simple social science experiment, and it's funny, I'm a pediatrician. I've been working with all these social scientists for a few years. I didn't know anything about social scientists, and I stopped joking and putting air quotes around social science because it is for real. So this is an experiment that Frameworks has done around a number of different issues, but we did it here. And this was several thousand subjects in an online experiment. And we described a bill in Congress that would have basically solved all the problems that children and families in America face, and basically diverted 20% of the federal budget to support kids and families and created a tax increase. So that was a bill that was described, and we gave a group of people a description of that bill, and much to my surprise, about a third or a little more than a third of people said they'd be supportive of that, which is kind of amazing. We then provided a description of that same bill, and we tested it with a little preamble that uses, for example, some of the frames that we currently use as advocates. So we said, kids in America are in crisis today. We really need to step up on what we're doing to support kids and families. And then we had the same description of the bill. Support for the bill was depressed by the messaging that we're actually using. If you then take that same bill description and say one of the most important things that we can do together as a society is to make sure that families have the resources that they need to support their kids and that the systems in place support them. And then the same bill description, statistically significant improvement in support of the bill, especially among Republicans and conservatives. So this stuff has the potential if we decide to use it. And it's very hard to make this shift because we are all hardwired to talk about things in the way that we've been talking about them. We want to talk about the fact that this is the right thing to do and it's more. We want to talk about the fact that we need to invest, that kids are our future. But these messages, which resonate so strongly with us, aren't necessarily doing what we need to do in the public. So that hopefully you get a little a little taste of what's possible from that story.
I think in our work with the We Vision Early Ed, in particular, I think what we're also demonstrating is the benefit of making the shifts. I think for some audiences, they want to see and what happens, right? Sort of the frame away from treating, I'll use childcare because it's the focus of the We Vision Early Ed, right? So what happens when you shift the message from childcare is solely a poverty intervention resource and not sort of a universal good, right? So I think there's an opportunity for funders to lean in a little bit and show that that future is possible so that we can have some concrete, tangible examples of what happens when you make that shift. What are the benefits of making that shift? And I think that's one place that funders can think about. I mean, we've even sort of thought about use that to rethink the way in which we fund our programs. Most of the programs we fund are sometimes solely target, right? It reinforces the mindset of the current system where they're also sort of looking at solely funding young children and families, support young children and families based on income. And certainly, yes, some families definitely need to be prioritized. So I'm not at all suggesting that we're not prioritizing the families that have been intentionally harmed in the systems we've created, but how do we also make the places we fund evidence of that mindset shift? Because it is a contrast to promote a mindset, and when you look at sort of your portfolio, you don't see it in there. And so just also sort of naming that as funders, we can be a place where you can see those ideals reflect that. I mean, I'd use childcare again as an example. We're more economically and racially segregated in K-12. And so
I want to
shifting.
make one point about mindsets. We talk as if there is a mindset that we have, and there are these kind of, one way to think about it, there are these pairs of mindsets that we all have within us, some of which are more forward in most people and others. So in most Americans, this notion of individualism is a mindset that's readily available to us. It's kind of what the country was built on. But there is another mindset that's available to us that's collective, right? And you see that come out, for example, in times of national crisis. We can act together under the right set of circumstances. And what framing does is it allows some of these mindsets that are potentially more in the background to come forward. And so if you use framing correctly, you can, in a way, suppress the mindsets that are working against your purposes and bring out the mindsets that are there, but not necessarily in the foreground. You can bring them forward.
All such incredible points to make and help infuse that hopefulness, right? Especially when you start to look back on history where we have had collective action connected often to collective outrage. But the possibility is huge and that in and of itself breeds hope and inspiration. And so I really, really want to thank our panelists today for this incredible discussion. If there are any additional questions, you can put them in the Q&A. And again, I want to remind you that links to many of the resources that our panelists mentioned are in the chat, along with the frame and other supporting references that our funders are supporting. So one of the important points that stood out today is that there's such incredible potential that we have through the collective caregiving frame to shift mindsets, really engage broader audiences in all of the work that we do, and ultimately create lasting change for generations to come. So I appreciate the emphasis today on action now for incredible outcomes now and later. Again, I want to remind everyone, as you already know, this work is complex and we have to stick to it and we have to come together. And as we come together, the possibilities are limitless. So I encourage everyone to take the insights today and apply them to your work where you know it's needed. Mind the mindsets and do the internal work in your organizations intentionally, because it's important. And let's together continue to push those boundaries, to challenge outdated mindsets and really embrace the opportunity to build a society where caregiving is indeed a true collective responsibility, and we get back to the village. Before we end, I really want to encourage everyone who participated today to fill out our survey. The Campaign for Grade Level Reading team does indeed look at your responses, and they use those responses to bring even better and more engaging content to the forefront. So again, I thank our esteemed panelists, and I thank our incredible guests for making the time to focus on this particular and important topic today.